Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming back after lunch so promptly. We are in the home stretch of our two-day 2024 NHGRI Symposium, and we are now shifting to our genome recognition of employee accomplishments and talents, which we simply call the GREAT Awards ceremony. And we're going to start, actually, with our keynote speaker. And for today's keynote speaker, I'm going to bring you all back down to earth. I get it. That was it's an astronaut joke, so I'm trying to increase my repertoire of jokes to include astronaut humor now. But in any case, I digressed again. I keep doing that. But rather than having me introduce our keynote speaker, I'm going to ask Sarah Hull, our Deputy Scientific Director, to come to the podium and introduce our keynote speaker.
I didn't get one of those. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So it seems the informal theme of this year's symposium is it's really cool to meet your heroes. So in that spirit, let me begin by saying just what an absolute honor it is for me to introduce you to one of my personal heroes and treasured colleagues, Dr. Karina Walters. Dr. Walters is the director of our NIH Tribal Health Research Office, also known as THRO, a position that she only started a year and a half ago. Before coming to NIH, Dr. Walters was a very successful extramural scientist and a tenured full professor at the University of Washington School of Social Work. She's also the founding director of the UW Indigenous Wellness Research Institute. By training, she's a social epidemiologist and behavioral health scholar and is a leading researcher on environmental, historical, social and cultural determinants of health and health equity in American Indian and Alaska Native communities. I hope it's okay for me to share a personal anecdote that I don't think I've mentioned yet to Dr. Walters. So it was probably around 10, 15 years ago when I was starting to get a little frustrated with some of the claims that I was hearing within the NIH research community and beyond, that we had essentially blown it. And it just wasn't going to be feasible to do genetic research with tribal communities. They didn't believe in genetic research, and they would never trust us. And I had a sense that maybe we weren't quite asking the right questions, like it's not, why won't they trust us, but why aren't we trustworthy? But I didn't really have an understanding or even the language at the time to figure that out, how to restore that trust and how to make good on what we as a federal government agency owe to US tribal populations, especially in terms of the promises and benefits of genomic discovery. That is not until I attended a Walls lecture in June 2014, right here on campus in Missouri Auditorium on innovation in methods and measures of historical trauma and microaggression distress, and I was totally riveted for the full hour. Here was the language and the understanding that we needed to start with. It was the first time I had ever heard of cultural and historical determinants of health and indigenous paradigms and frameworks for research that was designed with the benefit of tribal populations in mind. So in case you haven't already figured it out, it was Dr. Walters who was the speaker that day. And so last year when I heard that she would be coming to the NIH to direct our Tribal Health Research Office, I couldn't be more thrilled. And Dr. Walters has really hit the ground running. And in the short time that she's been here, she's just generated so much enthusiasm across the NIH and within NHGRI for the mission of THRO. We happen to be very well represented on a number of THRO working groups that are working hard and rapidly to address some of the exciting and tough research and policy challenges that lie ahead. Let me also thank you, Eric, for your wisdom in selecting Dr. Walters to be here with us today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Walters to the podium for today's keynote.
Hallo, Chief Hatupusik Anchanspo Echebeche Hoyo Michichata si Hoke Michiyokoke Okla Piscataway people. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Karina Walters. I just introduced myself in the Choctaw language. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, and also acknowledge the territory that we're in. This is traditionally Nakachunk and Piscataway Conoy people's territory. And actually, there's a little stream that runs here on campus, if you have had a chance to walk by it. That stream follows a path that was part of ancient hunting grounds. So we're actually on ancient hunting grounds here that a number of tribes used to interact with this landscape here. So yeah, it's always good to know where you stand and who you're connected with. And thank you for that introduction, Sarah. That was an anecdote I didn't expect, so that was kind of fun. And thank you, Dr. Green, and congratulations to the awardees today. So glad to be here and share some time with you. I'm going to talk a little bit. I'm going to start off, let me see, make sure I know how to, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit to contextualize my talk around. I'm going to talk in a minute about indigenous data sovereignty, but I first want us to get a little bit into a mindset about how I approach things here as director of THRO, but also my research, and Sarah gave a little bit of hint of this. But I want to talk about water. So let's start with water. You know, I want you to think about each time you, well, first of all, let's start with where does water go? Right? When we have water, it comes down from the heavens and it comes down here, and then what does it do? It goes right back up, right? We have this cycle of this water always returning. And water for indigenous people, for all of us, and for all humans, is very sacred, very important, right? And that's why we talk about Mini Wichoni, or sacred water, or the Lakota that talked about that. If you remember the Dakota Access Pipeline that was about the water. But water is sacred, water is medicine. Majority of the earth is water, majority of our body is water. We are birthed from our mother's waters. So water is just really beautiful medicine. So I want you to think about that water today, because as you take a sip of that water, and we know that it rises to heavens and comes back down. So each time your lips touches water, from a native point of view, we're thinking that our lips are touching the same water that our ancestors' lips touched. In that minute, when I'm taking a sip of that water, I'm directly connecting with my ancestors. And what a beautiful relationship then we have to that water, right? Well, so too do our bodies carry stories that our ancestors experienced as well. And you guys are NHGRI, you know about some of this incredible science around that. And so just as we're connected across generations from experiences, even intergenerational trauma, we know that there's some evidence for that having impact on our bodies. So too, does that ancestral love also come through for us from a native point of view. But we really truly are not living the health reality that our ancestors dreamed for us, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So I want to keep that interconnectedness in mind as we talk about it, and that worldview in mind as we talk about data, because sometimes people forget that. It gets very dry very quickly. But for us, data is like that water. We have a relationship to it. It embodies a story or an experience or a being in some cases for our tribe. So data is really critical. But we actually have an important opportunity to connect to the power that our ancestors carry in our responsibilities here at the NIH. So in this moment, so there's another thing to get that intergenerational thinking in. In this moment, I am my great-great-great-granddaughter's grandmother. In this moment, I am my great-great-great-grandmother's granddaughter. Whew, sorry. In this moment, I'm all of those things. So if I take action for my health and well-being right now, I'm not just impacting myself or my family or my community. I have an opportunity to impact the next 7 generations. What a powerful place to be. And importantly, I also have an opportunity to impact literally at the biological level in terms of my body and my behaviors. I have an opportunity to heal the things that my ancestors didn't get an opportunity to heal. And again, that's a place of power, not a place of disempowerment. And I think a lot of American Indian research, people think about all of the tragedies and all the struggles, but we don't want to forget that we are actually sitting in a place of power and opportunity. The second thing is, my ancestors, so the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, we're all the descendants of those who survived the Trail of Tears. We were the first ones to be removed on the Trail of Tears. Cherokee always try to get all the credit. It was actually us. And, you know, our ancestors walked that Trail of Tears with a vision of love and a vision of life for me, for all of us. And we have a responsibility to reconnect, to enact our power and reconnect to that vision of love and life in all that we do. And so that's why at THRO and, part of our philosophy at THRO, and I'm going to talk about this more in a minute, is to be a good ancestor in all that we do, because that's not only our opportunity, it's our responsibility. And again, we can affect change across generations. So it's really about power, love, and vision. And when I talk about love, I mean that ancestral love, long time ago love that we still get to carry. And as you know, we're in the office of the director at the National Institutes of Health here. And I just want to acknowledge when I first came on, I was, first of all, becoming a Fed was a whole transition. I'm still transitioning. And of course, you have to learn lots of acronyms, and you create more acronyms. That's part of the job. But one of the things I discovered very quickly was, and it's both a strength and sometimes a little bit of a struggle at the NIH, which is each institute has its own brain system, right? It made me think of this. It made me think of an octopus. Each institute has its own brain system, and but we don't always coordinate as well as we possibly could. We do our best, but we also really value the individuality of each of the institutes. And I think that's a really positive thing. But my job at THRO cuts across all of that. And so I'm always trying to figure out how do we pull some things together, how do we coordinate better, how do we do things better to serve the interests of American Indian Alaska Native health and health equity. And the reason why this is a little bit of an issue is because all the institutes were basically kind of operating slightly differently around indigenous data indigenous data protocols and research protocols. And so one of the things that we really realized, I realized really early on, is that we needed to harness our system a little bit better so that we were all on the same page around data sovereignty, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about that today. But to contextualize that, our mission at the Tribal Health Research Office, first of all, we are literally the synergistic hub for all American Indian and Alaska Native activities on campus, research activities. Our job is to lead, but also to consult and coordinate and collaborate with all the NIH institutes and centers. But because we work directly with tribes, we are a very forward-facing office, working directly with tribal communities. 574 federally recognized tribes, over 200 state-recognized tribes. So it's a lot of groups that we interface with and we have a responsibility to. But our ultimate goal, though, is to grow indigenous health and health equity through meaningful, culturally credible, indigenous-driven science. And when I say indigenous, I mean indigenist. I don't mean just indigenous. It's not enough to have a Native person at the helm doing this. It doesn't mean that we will have the thinking around the worldviews that need to be embedded in the processes or understanding of the deep methodologies and methodological approaches that we need to do to produce real sustainable population health change. To really get sustainable health change, we have to be of and from and connected directly to the worldviews of the communities we're serving, right? We purposely use that term indigenous in that respect. Okay, so I promptly, with my team, created an acronym because that was the first accomplishment here when I came on board. But our acronym is based on CEDAR. And CEDAR for us is a really great medicine in indigenous traditions all over this country, all over North America. Almost every tribe has a connection to CEDAR. And almost every tribe has CEDAR as medicine, different purposes sometimes, but it's usually connected to purification or healing or cleansing. And we've just felt like this would be a great acronym to be the values that undergird our approach in working in Indian country. And so C stands for creativity, and again, going to the indigenous methodologies, that we really want to move beyond these conventional approaches to science and center innovative, indigenous-centered methods and knowledges to ensure science drives that sustainable population health change I was talking about. And of course, ethics. We want the highest ethics and professional and ethical behavior, and ensuring transparency and honesty in all of our transactions. And D is for determination, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And that has to do with self-determination or honoring tribal sovereignty. And there's a real legal stance to that. It's not an ideological stance, and I'll share more about that in a minute. And then, of course, accountability. We can't do our work unless we're accountable to the people we're serving, right? Our job is to not only help and coordinate with the ICs, so I'm serving all of you, but I'm also ultimately, my responsibility is directly to serve the poor and the sick and the folks who are suffering in our indigenous communities, because we want to make our communities whole and well. And then respect and relational responsibilities. And again, it gets to that thinking I was talking about, right? So we respect and value the unique, diverse talents across the NIH and across our communities, across our own practitioners and scientists that are community-based. And we fulfill our responsibilities with, compassion and dignity. These are our aspirations. And through our efforts, we want to honor past, present, and future generations, and are attentive to ancestral, cultural, and traditional obligations as indigenous people, and we strive to be a healthful and good ancestor in all that we do. So these are our foundations for our actions at the Tribal Health Research Office. So who we serve 574 tribes, I acknowledge that. 220 of those tribes are in Alaska. Very, very small remote communities up in Alaska. We're one of the fastest growing groups in the country. We're projected to grow to 10.1 million by 2050. And we still have over 200 unique languages. In some tribes, for example, the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, 80% of the tribe, their first language is Choctaw, not English. And we still have many tribes like this in our country, and people aren't aware of that. We also engage Native Hawaiian relatives as well, because they are, and other indigenous populations in U.S. territories of the Pacific. One, because they're indigenous, but two, because we also have a federal obligation to consult and work with Native Hawaiian populations in particular, because the United States government recognizes them as indigenous peoples. So that gets to the issue of, why all this attention and why do we have a separate THRO office? And it's because as a federal agency and as a federal government, we have a direct and unique obligation to serve American Indian Alaska Native people. Bottom line, people either ceded their territories or their territories were taken, but nevertheless, people put down their weapons in exchange for, in perpetuity, a federal trust relationship and obligation to ensure that our health, our welfare, our education, all ways of being for us are still in place. We even have federal trust lands that are tied to that trust responsibility still. So there's a mandate, hundreds of treaties, along with Supreme Court, the President and Congress have basically affirmed that tribal government has tribal sovereignty. And the federal Indian trust responsibility, or the trust relationship that we enact with tribes, is literally a legal and fiduciary, and it's enforceable obligation on the part of the U.S. to protect tribal treaty rights, lands, assets, and resources, including our economic, social, and our health and welfare, right? And the goal is to raise the standard of living and well-being for American Indians and Alaska Natives. So this is by law, and a lot of people don't understand that. They think it's an entitlement. It's not an entitlement. So, okay. Moving on, I do want to acknowledge, though, even though there's a legal obligation and idea of sovereignty that's based on U.S. legal code, and tribes invoke that, but tribes have been sovereign well before the United States was ever established. We've always been sovereign. So I just wanted to put that out there, because we existed pre-United States, right? Thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, 30,000 years for some of our tribes. That's documented. And this activist, and leader, a beautiful woman named Ingrid Washanawata, really put it well from a Native perspective. She said, sovereignty is the wafting thread securing the components that make a society. And without that wafting thread, you cannot make a rug. Without that wafting thread, all you have are unjoined, isolated components of a society. So sovereignty runs through the vertical strands and secures the entire pattern. That is the fabric of Native society. So we've had sovereignty since time immemorial in these territories. Just want to show you we're currently, there's over 324 American Indian Alaska Native reservations and off-reservation trust lands. And you'll notice Oklahoma has a big chunk there now. That's from the recent McGirt decision that was not just a couple of years ago. So basically, it's a giant, almost a giant reservation now because it was always a reservation, but they hadn't honored the proper treaties. And anyways, but now it's recognized, went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the reason why this is an issue is because we're sovereign nations. What that means is, just like the United States government is a sovereign nation, we have data security concerns as well. And we expect, tribes expect, that sovereignty around data security would be honored. And what that means is Tulsa, which used to be considered an urban location, in the past, we would have not had to consult with tribes technically in Tulsa because it's a city. Now, we would have to consult with 3 tribes because there's 3 overlapping tribes that is now that reservation land in that community. So there's very specific obligations, and you could see where the bulk, it's not coincidental that the bulk of everybody is west of the Mississippi. And why is that? The Indian Removal Act in the 1830s, where my tribe was the first to be moved. So back to, we are living a health reality that our ancestors did not dream for us. And I do want to raise this, even though I started with a little bit of positive about the power, love, and vision. Please keep that in mind as I talk about some of these numbers. The reality is we suffer from a chronically underfunded and inaccessible and inadequate healthcare system. And that's just the reality that we're in. Our structural determinants of health are among the poorest in the country, right? We experience substandard, overcrowded housing, food deserts. Food insecurity is 1 out of 4. During COVID crisis, it went to 1 out of 3 of our Native families. We're living not only without adequate food, but living, parents having to give up eating for a day to be able to feed their children. It was very desperate. Lack of clean or accessible water. We still don't have electricity in some of our communities. We still have disproportionate exposure to damaging environmental hazards, pollutants, and toxins. And this is a very serious concern. Some of the highest rates of cancer in this country are tied directly to the uranium tailings, for example, in the Southwest, that is still yet to be fully cleaned up. So compounding the crisis, few of us are in higher education, and as a result, we're underrepresented, not only in the healthcare serving systems, but especially in research, right? About 14.5% achieve college degrees, in contrast to 31% for the general population. Just to give you an idea, if I had 1,000 PhDs in this room, how many would be American Indian or Alaska Native if you were to take a guess? Go ahead, shout it out. One over here. That's close, 3. But how many would be a researcher? 0.25 maybe. Because most Native people, when we get our PhDs, we're getting it to serve directly our communities. Quite often, especially in healthcare professions, in nursing or in medical school or other kinds of ways to serve our community, not necessarily in research. So for us at the NIH, we have some work cut out to do to build our workforce so that we have a workforce that's relevant to our communities. But these and other structural factors have led to high multiple chronic disease burden and basically syndemics, where we're dealing with synergistic multiple epidemics simultaneously. We don't just have heart disease, we have heart disease and diabetes. We don't just have COPD, we have COPD and PTSD and hypertension. We're dealing with multiple epidemics simultaneously. And what does this lead to? Obviously, premature mortality. And currently, we now have the lowest life expectancy in the country of any population, worse since World War II. Our life expectancy is 65. 1 out of 4 of us died before the age of 45. My mom died at age 45 from her 3rd rare form of cancer that was likely due to toxin exposure from her mother laboring in lettuce fields in the 1940s. So this is our reality. I worked in some of the communities we went and visited. The life expectancy in some Southwest communities that we visited is age 46 for men, 52 for women. That is not the health reality my ancestors walked the Trail of Tears imagining for us to have, right? So we're facing multiple public health crises, but few are listening. And the bottom line is we're invisible. We're invisible to public awareness. I can go on about why I think that is, and maybe I'll talk a little bit about that. But it's our opportunity now to realign and reconnect to that power, love, and vision, to change the course that we're on, and to harness our collective science and our collective scientific and indigenous wisdom to achieve health and health equity. And part of that is making ourselves visible. And that's another reason why indigenous data sovereignty matters. It's not just a data security issue for our communities or just an ethics issue. It's that we have the right and the obligation to make sure we are represented in data so that we can make good, healthful decision-making about policies and ways to move forward to create a better society for ourselves. So, at THRO, then, our story is about harnessing our power to heal through science. And we do this, we hope to turn culturally informed discovery into health equity by advancing indigenous research, cultivating capacity both internally, so working at NIH and also sharing knowledge and helping to train. I use my hands a lot, don't I? But also externally in terms of building up our research workforce. And one responsibility that we have is engagement and consultation. So also by federal law, we're mandated to consult with tribes, that if NIH is going to come up with a new initiative that will have an impact potentially on tribal communities, by law, we have to do something called tribal consultation. It's a very official process, and no, all of us regular people don't get to say anything, actually. It's literally the tribal leaders hear about the policy, and it's a formal consultation process. And the THRO office, we actually run that. But the one part that really I love is blazing new paths for strategic initiatives, policies, and collaborations. And I kind of talked a little bit earlier, and I hinted at epigenetics for American Indians, Alaska Natives. Our communities have been saying for a long time, we want better understanding of how intergenerational trauma and violence impacts us at the cellular and biological levels, and what can we do to address that. And we have a boarding school healing summit coming up December 18th to 20th, and NHGRI, please come. It will be also online, so I hope that we have some future scientists that are going to be a part of that conversation as well. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about that perspective. And another reason why data sovereignty needs to be addressed here at NIH. So, natives have proverbs. I don't care what tribe you're from, anywhere in the world. All of us have proverbs that tie our relationship to land in a very specific way. It is deeply self-collective oriented and personal. And almost always a proverb is something along the lines, or the saying is, I am the land is me. But settler colonial practices, the approach is, I own the land is mine. So we have a fundamental conflict, right? So let's translate that into data and what our tribes have had to deal with. For us, I am the data is me. Literally, our tribes say this is us. And if we're talking about our biological material, it's literally our spirit that is being held here still. So it's that deep for our communities. And then we have to deal with research that sometimes says things like, but I own the data and the data is mine. And so I just want to put that out there. We have kind of an initial conflict that we have to start to address and really look at. And where does this thinking kind of originate from? So from a Native point of view, and I just want to say there's some great work out there on settler colonial theory. I encourage you to read about that. There's a journal called Settler Colonial Studies. It's a good journal. It talks about the different theories around settler colonialism around the world. But basically, I'm going to summarize it in 30 seconds or less. So the United States settler colonial policies, settler colonialism consists of policies and structures. They're not events. It's the structures that facilitate either native land disposition, taking land, and then erasing native people from the land so that you can then create new stories to put on that land that maintains the power imbalance, that maintains a narrative about manifest destiny or how this land was always our land, those kinds of things. So the theorists talk about this as a structure and not an event. And why is that important to distinguish? Because there are historically traumatic events, like the boarding school events, that's a good example, when Native people were taken from their homelands and forcibly put into boarding schools. And we're not talking Andover. We're not talking that kind of boarding school, for those of you who are not familiar, where children were removed from their parents on average 7 years and placed into these boarding schools. They went from 1818 to 1970. And these boarding schools, the goal was to erase the Indian and to forbid language, forbid spiritual practices, replace it with Christianity. And basically, if families balked at that or tried to fight it, they would be imprisoned or food rations would be withheld from their communities or their families. So that was a historically traumatic event, for example. So these structures and policies, I'm sorry, let me back up. So these historically traumatic events are designed to uphold settler colonial structures and policies. So they have a relationship with each other. And these structures and policies have values that are tied to it that we don't even think about sometimes in American history because it's so part of our air that we breathe, that we've been taught. And a good example is manifest destiny or the doctrine of discovery, both of which are coded into U.S. law. So what are these structures designed to do? They're designed to distort historical realities, free future generations from accountability. You know, that wasn't me, that was them kind of thing. But ultimately, it's about rationalizing and normalizing the rights to dispossess, so to erase, to replace, and then put onto them origin narratives. Thanksgiving's coming up. That's a great origin myth. That's a good example of one, right? We all can feel good, gratitude and everything, Turkey Day, yeah, the pilgrims came and we gave them food and we helped save them. That's not the story about Thanksgiving, folks. It's a bloody story. The first Thanksgiving was the governor celebrating the massacre. And Native people's heads were kicked in the street as soccer balls. That was the first Thanksgiving. So those are the stories that are distorted and lost. Okay, so that serves a function. And why is this important for a data point of view? Is because, for Native people, they're saying, our communities are saying, hey, we're worried the same kind of experience is going to happen with our data, right? You're going to take the data, going to run with it, and somehow that is going to have an impact that's going to potentially hurt us. It's manifest in stories like data, the biological data is the new gold mines. I saw an article that said that. And for Native people, that gets us very nervous because where there's gold, there's erasure and there's potential genocide. So we worry about that. Okay. So blood quantum is another example of this. And so the other issue about the issue of blood and why that matters to us and thinking about that in terms of genetic research and cellular research. A lot of you, how many of you know about the 1705 Virginia blood law? Anybody know about that? Oh, a couple, all right, yay, I'm so happy. Yeah, well, the Virginia colony was the first to adopt the race blood quantum laws that limit civil and land rights of American Indians, Africans, and it was based on blood degree. So a lot of folks don't know that the one-drop rule was based on this law, but also the flip side. So it's the flip side of the same coin. The one-drop rule for African Americans, but the half-blood rule for American Indians. Why? I'll tell you a little bit about that. If you're half American Indian, half Native, you were determined to be mulatto or not really Native anymore, and so what can you do? Take land. You're no longer part of the land, so now I can have your land, right? So it was in the interest of the settlers during that period to have a law that basically erased indigenous people from land, and then what? Then you became enslavable. So there was also slave laws that went with that for American Indians as well. And then for African Americans, it's the flip side, right? If you have just one drop, then that justified, in their mind, chattel slavery, right? So Patrick Wolf says, as opposed to enslaved people whose reproduction augmented their owner's wealth, that's the reason why one drop, indigenous people obstruct access to land and resources, and so you don't want more Native people. You want to quantum them away as quickly as possible. So that started in 1705. So anything having to do with our blood, believe me, we all know this. We get very nervous very quickly about that. So I'm just providing you a little bit of context of why there's mistrust. The other reason why there's high levels of mistrust is because, a lot of you probably have been taught in ethics about the Havasupai case. How many of you know about the Havasupai case, right? And that was in the 2000s. Basically, researchers went in and they took blood for the purpose of diabetes research, didn't get the findings they wanted, and they started looking at other things, didn't get permission or consent from the individuals involved or the tribe, and basically started looking at things like inbreeding, which was very harmful to the community and very upsetting to the community. So out of that, accumulation of multiple incidents, that finally tipped the scales for a lot of Native communities and tribes that really pushed after that to actually forbid, Navajos actually forbid genetic research after that in part because of the Havasupai case, because of the harm that was caused by that. But I just want to remind us that this is a long history for us. So going all the way back to the 1860s. And why am I raising this? Because there's a history of federal government intervention. So when we talk about federal research, we got to think about that. These federal government interventions in our communities in the name of science, that was very, very harmful. And so in the 1860s, the Army Medical Museum, Surgeon William Hammond ordered all medical officers and field personnel to collect all specimens of morbid anatomy, surgical or medical, which may be regarded as valuable. And the government basically paid. If you brought an American Indian head in, you got money for it. And so there were a number of massacres that were happening during that period of time. The Sand Creek Massacre is a famous one. And Colonel Shivington obliged. And he cut off the heads of children and women and shipped them to the Army Medical Museum in compliance with the federal call. And so now, by 1898, the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History had received over 2,000 of the 4,000 heads amassed by the Army Medical Museum. And we're still trying to repatriate some of this stuff back. That's a whole other story. The Native American Graves Protection Act that finally got passed about 20 years ago demands repatriation of these kinds of remains back to communities. But we still estimate there's about 160,000 funerary remains. So this is just a little timeline of the kinds of events that our communities have endured, including in the 20th century. So surgeries, trachoma eye surgeries, experiment left thousands of people blind. It was not a tested surgery yet. They tested it on us. Grave robbing, and so forth. So there's been a lot. Even as recently in 2015, International Tribe said, we've had enough. Please send us back our blood samples, and that took many, many years even to get that transfer operational. So why now at the NIH? So that's the background why there's high levels of mistrust in our community. You can understand data security and data sovereignty is a big issue in Indian country. It's because it's connected to all of these issues, from the structural issue, the policies, and the practices that we've endured. But why at NIH and why now? So when I came, I really observed that, I noted this earlier, that there's some scientific and biospecimen practices that were just not consistently aligned or updated to match current tribal laws. Many tribes have their own research laws and ordinances that are very strict, and we just haven't been keeping up to speed with that. We've also had lots of questions about what to do with international biospecimens, and tribes are asking for a return of specimens, so that's an issue. And then there were questions around, well, what do we do with paleogenomic data? How do we handle that in a sensitive way? Or gene sequence data. Is gene sequence data, for example, from a Native perspective, poor Sarah's probably like, oh my goodness. One of my first meetings, I was like, gene sequence data. Now, from the bones of some of these ancestors of living people who are still around now, so the question I had, does the NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection Act, apply to that gene sequence data? And the answer is no, it doesn't, because it's not culturally material according to law. So you have to have physical material, it can't just be gene sequence data to fall under NAGPRA ruling. And so, but to help my colleagues understand what it would mean to a Native community in hearing that, because for us, it's still culturally material. And let me give you an example why. If I went into your home and I took your safe with all of your money, and you said, give me my safe back, and I said, okay, but I deposited the money in my bank, now I just have numbers that represent your dollars, and I gave you back the safe, I'm compliant with the law, but how would you feel? You'd be a little bit, well, wait a minute, that money has meaning to me. And so I said, we have to remember that there's some thinking about that. So the tension at the NIH, and the tension for all of us, is how do we honor really differences in approaches and be able to honor the sovereignty and honor the wishes of a Native community who also want good science and really want to be part of science moving forward to be beneficial for communities. So it's not about Native people not wanting great science and genetic research. People do, but they want to be involved in the discussions. They want it on their terms to be able to have it be credible and have some collective benefit in a way that really truly benefits communities and not in a way that is extractive, since that's what we've endured for so long. Okay, but there's been lots of transformations about that, and out of all of these experiences, we now have an indigenous data sovereignty movement. Now, honestly, this started probably in the 90s with some really great leaders out there back in the day, but since then, it's really taken a lot of momentum, I think, post-Havasupai. And so there's some really great groups like Stephanie Carroll Russo and her group in Arizona that have been doing a lot of work in this area. But basically, it's the indigenous sovereignty and governance movement. And what does indigenous data sovereignty mean? What it is, it's the right of tribal nations to exercise their sovereign authority and govern the collection, ownership, stewardship, management, sharing, transfer, reuse, disposition, and disposal of data collected from and about their tribal populations, particularly when such data has a potential to impact the economic, social, cultural, and general welfare of tribal nations. This is not new. The United States government does this already, so it's not like we're introducing something new. People are like, oh, data security, and it's going to somehow breach scientific integrity. I'm like, no, guys, we already have data security issues at the national level. We don't automatically share data. We sometimes have restricted access to data for other foreign governments and other kinds of things. So this is not new. It's just new in terms of thinking about it in terms of tribes here in the United States. We also have some unique things because of our trust relationship and tribal sovereignty status for tribes. Tribes are actually exempt from some things that are typical for NIH IRB practices. The Common Rule is an example of that. So basically in 2018 when they revised the Common Rule, they basically said tribal research laws and ordinances take precedent and federal agencies must follow these laws if the tribal laws and research ordinances are more restrictive than the Common Rule. And I could tell you right now they are. For the majority of tribes, it is definitely much more restrictive. So in that case, we're exempt. And what's really great is NIH was forward thinking in this, and the data sharing management policy that was developed originally, thank you very much, Dr. Hull and others who were involved in that, that set the foundation for us to be able to launch this IDS, move into the direction of indigenous data sovereignty. And basically, our data management policy, currently sharing policy at the NIH says, or the guidance says, that NIH respects tribal sovereignty even in the absence of written tribal laws or policies. Why is this important? Because we have some very small tribes. We have tribes that are under-resourced. Not every tribe has research laws and ordinances, so we don't want to penalize tribes who don't have those laws and ordinances in place. We want to be able to work with them, that we are assuring them that we will work with their protocols and what they would like to do. So how do we honor our responsibilities and be these good ancestors in terms of data sovereignty? We've had 9 listening sessions so far with tribal communities, as well as Native researchers, NIH researchers, our tribal advisory board. I went to Oklahoma, met, because there's some unique issues in Oklahoma, met with tribal leaders there. So we've had 9 listening sessions so far. We had an Indigenous Data Sovereignty Summit here at the NIH, where we brought experts together to both at the NIH and out in our communities to talk about what themes and issues need to be addressed in a data sovereignty policy at the NIH. And we've been meeting with OSP and other kinds of groups to have these conversations. I got to share some information with NHGRI at another meeting. So we're in the process of gathering information, starting to outline what are some of the thematic issues we need to be thinking about as we design a policy, an Indigenous data sovereignty policy at the NIH. And 3 things came up around culture that I just wanted to highlight, which shouldn't come as a surprise at this point. One is that tribes are basically asking us to think of samples, especially biological samples, living and non-living samples though, as our relations. That relational way of thinking again, right? And that includes plant, water, land, DNA, and other biological derivatives. They're saying these are our sacred kin, and we have to honor them in that way. The second thing is that we also have to honor individual Native people's choices to share the biological material as well. And those are sacred offerings. And American Indian holy man, Richard Movescamp, basically talked about, he's a Sundance leader, and at Sundance ceremonies, part of the ceremonies is you give what's called a flesh offering sometimes. So people will take a little piece of flesh and you do prayer and you offer it. He said that's the same thing. When people have given their data for cancer research or whatever they've asked, that they've given their data for, they do the same thing, that's their sacred offering. They're giving their piece of themselves so that others may be well, just like we do in ceremonies. The third element is sacred knowledge, is that we have to really recognize that there are issues around indigenous knowledges and cultural protocols tied to samples that require traditional guardianship practices in some cases, and that there's a collectivity in understanding sacred knowledges that is connected to the indigenous populations we're serving. Good example is the mamala bark. Prostatin was developed out of mamala bark, right, from the mamala bark. The mamala bark, how did we know about mamala bark? Samoan traditional healers had been using mamala bark to activate people's immune systems to help people heal and get well. It's one of the main drugs for HIV now, right? So, and everyone did right by that, which is they worked with the traditional keepers of that knowledge. They had permission, everything looked really good. But then the community stepped in later and said, that's collective knowledge. That's not an individual's opportunity to give that knowledge away. So you needed to consult with the whole tribe, not just the individual. So that collectivity and that traditional guardianship tied to that collectivity is something that the tribes really emphasize when we've been meeting with them. So some of the lessons that we've learned so far is the importance of our policy to ensure that we're honoring tribal sovereignty and governance, and basically that tribes have authority over data collected on tribal lands, or if data inferences or attributions to the tribes are being made. So even if you're going into an urban environment and you're not technically on what is everything's tribal land to me, but in terms of what is legally tribal lands in the United States right now, if you're going to make inferences to a tribe, so if I go to Rapid City, South Dakota, and I think, I don't really want to bother with having to go through the tribe for consent and getting permission, but I want to go study Lakota people, so I'm going to go to Rapid City and collect samples there. That's a no-no. Because you're still making inferences to the tribe, and you're still doing it with the intent of targeting a particular tribe. And then the second piece is ownership and authority over the data rests with the tribe. So prior to the data collection, tribes have said, we must clarify with the tribe in writing who owns or co-owns the data, what the co-ownership looks like, how data will be stewarded or on loan to researchers, and how the data will be protected in terms of the community and for future generations. Tribal sovereignty, so some of the other themes include all data practices must be tribally approved prior to data collection. So you can't backtrack on this. So you've got to get it up front. And of course, amendments can be made, but that requires researchers, PIs, to work directly with tribes. You have to go and talk to tribes, get consent, and move forward that way. Individual benefits are good to identify, but they really want collective benefit. They want to say, how is this going to help our people? How is this going to help our community? And of course, free informed prior consent. The other piece, which gets a little controversial, because NIH has a single IRB of record approach when you have multiple sites involved. Tribes are saying, well, we actually have the right to designate our IRB of record or our review body. As a matter of fact, we might even say the university or NIH has the IRB of record, but we still have the authority to have a research review team to approve things before moving forward, even if the IRB says it's okay. We still need another body to review it. Individual rights will be honored for data disposal, and that gets back to the sacred offering piece, right? So tribes must abide by individual consent. In other words, so tribes can't say, well, that's our data, so we get to take it now, even though someone said, you only have my data for 5 years, and now I want it destroyed. If an individual says, I want my data destroyed, the tribe has to honor it. Okay, am I almost right? And the other thing I would just want to highlight is irreversible and timeless consents. So that also has an impact at NIH, right? So tribes are saying, you have some of our data from the 60s or the 50s, and that's great, but we don't want timeless consent anymore. We want to be able to be a part of that process. So let's look at that again. And the other issue for the urbans, same thing. Basically, if you're going to make inferences to a tribal community, even if it's secondary data, then you've got to go get permission from that tribe. So that's it. And then finally, I just want to end with this, which is indigenous data sovereignty is only as good as tribes are able to govern their data, right? So we have also an obligation at NIH to help support and help tribes develop structures so they have their own data repositories, or they have frameworks or IRBs or ability to be able to do the governance process. So IDS could be all symbolic on this end, but if it can't be enacted at the community level, it's not going to be healthful or helpful. And so we have a little bit of a plan that we're starting to think about making sure that we can begin to look at that. And then finally, I just wanted to highlight Native American Heritage Month is this month, and I am the data is me is our theme. And I invite you to join us on November 26th and November 27th, but November 26th will be of most interest to you all, which is we've got an incredible international panel of geneticists, indigenous geneticists from Australia and New Zealand and the United States who are going to be talking about, the ethics involved in developing indigenous reference genomes. So y'all can geek out together with them. So I'm going to end there, and then, do we have time for questions? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great. We want to encourage folks to come up to the mics and ask your questions. Do you want me to call on people, or you?
Oh, yeah.
You got that?
Yeah.
Or we could just alternate. Do you want to start, Eric?
Sure, happy to. Thank you so much. That was so informative. One of the things I would think would be such a challenge here is lumpers versus splitters. I mean, a lot of what you're talking about are in generalizations, but you're dealing with hundreds of communities. And so how do you navigate what must be incredible heterogeneity of thought, practice, culture, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, great question, Dr. Green. That's the reason why we're not micromanaging. So we're not going to be about micromanaging. It's about setting principles and policies in place that all the tribes can plug into. So bottom line is we have to be following research laws and ordinances at the local tribe. If the tribe does not have one in place, we will talk with them about their research review board, or for them to designate a body that we would work with to ensure that the protocols are aligned with what the tribe desires and needs. And so that we can work with. We don't want to get overly prescriptive because that binds us to things that tribes may change their mind or they may not want later on, but to ensure just that tribes have the right, the authority and the right to determine what's going to be best. And that includes all the way to the dissemination of data, making sure that, tribes aren't going to say, don't disseminate data, but they're saying we have the right to review it before it goes out to ensure it's not going to cause harm to our community.
Thank you so much. That was really terrific. I understand from the boarding school tragedies that there were a number of unmarked graves, and I was just wondering, are DNA technologies being used to try to identify those remains and repatriate them?
I think in some cases that is the case. I cannot say which folks. I do know some tribes are employing some of that. Secretary Holland was involved and was, she had 2 reports that just came out. Part of it was to find as many unmarked graves as they could and determine what was happening locally. There are some intact records that identify what tribe the children belong to, and in some cases are not. So I do think people will be employing DNA technology. Not all tribes have the affordability for that, so there's some issues around that as well.
Thanks.
But people are bringing some of their children home. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for that great talk. So you talked a lot about how it's important for researchers to respect the wishes of these communities and like how their samples are used and the kinds of questions that they are asking. I work on the extramural side, and it always strikes me that the way that we fund research isn't really in line with that, right? Building those relationships with communities requires funding, and it's not clear to me how we can enable that at the NIH. So could you talk a little bit about how we can do that better?
Great observation. And one of the things that there are some mechanisms that are being used and kind of tested right now. The HEAL program is a good example. The NCRU program for American Indians, Alaska Natives to address opioid addiction has a 2-year buildup in their grant mechanism, and it's an OTA mechanism, so it's not the typical R01. OTA is really advantageous because there's a lot more flexibility in it to be able to do things like this, where you can have a year building up of those relationships or building up the protocols and things, or infrastructure. And the NCRU grant actually does that. It's to build up a research infrastructure for 2 years. I think that's part of our conversation internally at the NIH to talk about new initiatives coming out to ensure some adequate time is built into that to ensure that protocols are set up in ways that make sense. But what we don't want to do is penalize investigators in the field to say, oh, we're going to hold up your funding. We do have some great examples of that in Canada. In the Canadian Indigenous Health Research Council up there, they actually say you've got up to 2 years to get this ironed out, and if it's not, then we will pull the funding. But they do give ample funding to get started. So there are some real issues about timelines and how do you build. And on the research end, I think part of it is also working really closely with the community and building those relationships so that communities know you're going to stick around and you're not just coming in and out. So that will help facilitate some of that moving faster as well. So,
great, thanks.
Yeah.
These will be the last 2 questions across the aisle, and then back to you, Charles.
Hi, I appreciate your talk. Since you state that trauma is intergenerational, and they say that a lot about African American trauma as well, even down to the biological level. I just want to clarify whether or not exactly what you mean by an indigenous approach. Is it more for a utilitarian purpose of gathering resources, or is it for some other reason?
It's more philosophical. You could say, I guess it's really, it's really ensuring that indigenous worldviews are centered in the process. And it's not enough to just have, for example, a woman or a Native person or a person representing the group to be present. It's about ensuring that the knowledges that are tied to that group experience are centered in that process. So one way to think about it is like, you could say it's woman-centered or you could say it's feminist, right? So it's a little bit more, it's saying it's a little bit more of a philosophical underpinning of ensuring that our knowledges are there. And that's not ideological. Actually, there's an executive order out under President Biden to ensure indigenous knowledges are centered in the work that we're doing.
Just to press that a little bit, is it possible that that approach might leave out the expansion of resources in the Native community? In other words, you mentioned about what percent of Native people are involved in the various professional aspects. Is this an opportunity to actually, or is the philosophical approach getting in the way of expanding that resource?
I don't think so. I think actually it's more likely to build sustainable options, because what the difference is that communities are going to know, a good example, let me back it up and say, here's a good example, instead of talking about it as a person thing, but more about an approach to science example. I can take an existing empirical intervention, and I could throw a medicine wheel on it and put a feather on it, and maybe put a little bit of indigenizing thought into it. That may be beneficial to a community. But if I say, let me work directly with the community and build the intervention from a really culturally derived perspective, that likelihood of that impact of that intervention is going to be not only greater and have kind of face and cultural validity, but I think it'll have better scientific validity and more likely to be sustainable. And we're seeing some research that's moved in that direction to really build out from more cultural knowledges. I'll give an example. I did a Choctaw Health promotion intervention where we built a new curriculum from a completely Choctaw perspective, utilizing our clan knowledge systems to guide behavioral change. And what helped behavioral change was us not giving information about, eat better, exercise more. It was about saying, how are you being an ancestor today? And then tying it directly to our cultural knowledges. And that motivated the behavioral change. So it could be a mechanism for behavioral change. So that's an example. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Whenever I listen to you, I learn quite a bit. And it also reminds me of how we can be so unjust to each other as humans, in a sense. So again, thanks for that wonderful talk. I wanted to press a little bit about the idea of developing a reference that is specific to Native Americans, indigenous people, because some of the things you talk is parallel to what we observe and deal with from African perspective. We actually thought about developing an African Human Genome Project, but we moved away from that primarily because we started to think that Africa is so central to understanding human genetics that it is better for us to do it in a global context. Okay, and then to train Africans to actually be able to use this data to tell their own story in a way that they understand more than anybody else. So I'm wondering, what is the justification, or how do you see that playing out? And what is the responsibility of indigenous people to the rest of the world? Because there are information in your own genetic background that I absolutely am convinced would be useful to the other parts of the world. So how do we marry these two things together?
Yeah, I mean, again, first I want to say that I think Native people would like to be a part of that science. So I don't think it's just about, again, like you highlighted, having African people be able to work directly with it and have that kind of input and process and would be critical for Native people as well. So I mean, I think what's happened is, unfortunately, a lot of times research is done on us, not with us. And so that's the fundamental shift that I'm saying that communities are saying we need to have in place. And because I'm not a geneticist, I don't have that training. I'm a behavioral scientist. But I'm sure Sarah can speak to this. We just came from the Banbury meeting where we just had a whole conversation about the building an indigenous reference genome and the problematics of current, reference groups. I mean, what was it? South America is mostly what we're compared to right now, if you're looking at, which isn't representative. So Native people have an interest in finding their own reference as well. I mean, they'd like to say, hey, we need to know within group, what is our reference point? How do we understand for us? I mean, Choctaws, they just discovered, my tribe, that they discovered a new blood type in my tribe. Fascinating. Like, what's that about? They're actually calling my tribe saying, can you start donating blood? Because we're trying to figure out what's happening with this. So there's still more to learn. But again, it just needs to be, we need to be involved in that conversation, and we need to be able to have some control if it's going to impact us. And that's all that communities are asking for. So we want science to progress. We just want to be part of it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One more round of applause for Dr. Walters.
Thank you.